In 1970, Ruth Buzzi stepped onto the Laugh-In set for what seemed like another normal sketch. Minutes later, she said something that would destroy her career. The FBI started watching her, sponsors pulled out, and the show's producers received a threatening phone call that changed everything. Now, the truth about TV's most controversial moment is finally coming out, and it's darker than anyone imagined. In 1967, television comedy followed a familiar pattern. Jokes had clear setups, sketches had predictable endings, and variety shows moved at a steady pace. But George Schlatter and Ed Friendly wanted something different. They wanted a show that felt alive, something that matched the chaotic energy of the world outside. Inspired by counterculture gatherings like Love-Ins and Be-Ins, they came up with Laugh-In, a comedy experiment that would break every rule on television. Schlatter called it a sensory assault. The show didn't ease into jokes or give audiences time to catch their breath. Instead, it fired off one gag after another in rapid succession. Every episode had over 350 quick-cut segments, bouncing between slapstick, satire, and surreal humor. Nothing lasted too long. The pace was relentless. 1 second, a comedian would make a sharp political joke, the next, someone would dance across the screen in a ridiculous costume. The inspiration came from many places. Vaudeville and burlesque shaped its humor. Ernie Kovac's experimental style influenced its unpredictability. But its biggest influence came from British satire. A show called That Was the Week That Was had already proven that television could tackle politics and social issues in a clever way. Schlatter and Friendly took that idea and turned it up to full volume. They mixed smart satire with absurdity, making sure that the show never felt preachy or predictable. Even the structure felt different. British comedy often used fast cuts and unexpected transitions, but Laugh-In pushed that idea to the extreme. Sketches had no clear beginning or end. Punchlines came out of nowhere. Scenes would shift before the audience had time to react. This chaotic energy wasn't an accident, it was designed to capture the feeling of modern life, where everything was happening all at once. Some viewers found it overwhelming, others couldn't get enough. Getting the show on television wasn't easy. When Schlatter and Friendly pitched it to networks, executives didn't know what to make of it. The format felt too risky. The pacing seemed too fast. NBC finally agreed to air a single special on September 9, 1967. It was a test, something they didn't expect to go very far. But the audience reaction was immediate. The ratings were high. People were talking about it. Within months, NBC ordered a full season. The first episode set the tone for everything that followed. Dan Rowan and Dick Martin led the show, bouncing off each other with quick banter. Guest stars like Barbara Feldon and Flip Wilson joined in, adding to the mix of personalities. Recurring segments like the Cocktail Party and Mod World introduced viewers to the show's unique style. The joke wall became a signature piece, with comedians delivering one-liners through small doors. Then there was News of the Future, where they made wild predictions, some of which, like Ronald Reagan becoming president, actually came true. At first, NBC thought Laugh-In would just fill a time slot, competing against long-running shows like Gunsmoke. But by its second season, it was the highest-rated show on television. It appealed to everyone. Parents and teenagers could watch it together. Some loved the slapstick humor, others appreciated the sharp satire. No matter who you were, something in Laugh-In would make you laugh. Dan Rowan and Dick Martin were an unlikely pair, but that was what made them perfect for Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. They started out performing in nightclubs, where they built a comedy act based on contrast. Rowan was the smooth talker, always in control, while Martin played the clueless goofball who never quite understood what was going on. That chemistry carried over to television. When Laugh-In premiered on January 22, 1968, it was unlike anything else on the air, fast, unpredictable, packed with one-liners and absurd skits. The show didn't just find an audience, it became the #1 show in America by its 8th episode. Rowan and Martin kept the madness from going completely off the rails. Their back-and-forth banter gave the show structure, even when everything around them was pure chaos. Martin would say something ridiculous, Rowan would roll his eyes, and the audience would eat it up. Their sign-off at the end of each episode, Rowan saying, "Say good night, Dick," and Martin replying, "Good night, Dick," became one of the most famous catchphrases on television. They weren't just hosts, though. Rowan played General Bull Wright, a parody of over-the-top military figures, while Martin had a recurring role as Leonard Swizzle, a tipsy partygoer who always seemed a little too drunk to function. The show moved at lightning speed, jumping from one sketch to the next with no warning. Jokes flew by so quickly that if you missed one, another was already on the way. That frantic energy was something new for television, and it changed comedy forever. Shows like Saturday Night Live wouldn't exist without Laugh-In paving the way. Some of the biggest stars to come out of Laugh-In weren't even well known when they joined. Goldie Hawn was one of them. She came on the show in 1968 as a bubbly blonde who seemed to giggle her way through every joke. The truth was, she wasn't acting. Producer George Schlatter told her not to rehearse, so her reactions would be completely real. Her infectious laugh made her a fan favorite almost overnight. Just 2 years later, she won an Academy Award for Cactus Flower and became one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Lily Tomlin joined in 1969 and instantly made her mark. She didn't just perform, she created characters. One of her best was Ernestine, a nasal-voiced telephone operator who made life miserable for anyone who picked up the phone. Every call started the same way, one ringy dingy. "Is this the party to whom I am speaking?" Then there was Edithan, a 5-year-old who sat in a giant rocking chair and delivered long-winded monologues, always finishing with, "And that's the truth." Tomlin's ability to create such memorable characters made her one of the show's biggest stars. Her success didn't stop there, she went on to star in movies like 9 to 5 and became one of the most respected comedians in Hollywood. Henry Gibson had a different style. While most of the show was loud and unpredictable, he kept things simple. He would step forward, hold up a giant flower, and say, "A poem by Henry Gibson." Then, he would recite a short, deadpan poem that was either completely absurd or a clever commentary on current events. His calm presence was the perfect contrast to the show's wild energy. Outside of Laugh-In, he used his platform to speak about environmental issues, writing poetry and articles about sustainability long before it became a popular cause. Jo and Worley was impossible to ignore. She had a booming voice, over-the-top costumes, and a comedic style that demanded attention. Every joke she delivered felt like a performance. She often sang in an exaggerated operatic style or threw in a dramatic pause before a punchline to make it even funnier. One of her most famous running gags was her collection of anti-chicken jokes, a bit so bizarre that it became part of her identity. Arte Johnson and Ruth Buzzi were responsible for some of the show's most unforgettable moments. Johnson had a character named Wolfgang, a German soldier who would suddenly pop up from behind a bush and say, "Very interesting, but stupid." That phrase became one of the most quoted lines from the show. Another of his characters, Tyrone F. Horn, pronounced Horne, was a creepy old man who spent every episode unsuccessfully flirting with Ruth Buzzi's character, Gladys Ormphby. She played the role perfectly. Gladys was grumpy, frumpy, and always ready to swing her purse at Tyrone whenever he got too close. Every time she hit him, the audience erupted with laughter. The routine was simple, but it never got old. Buzzi's performance made her one of the show's biggest stars, earning her 5 Emmy nominations and a Golden Globe. One of the things that made Laugh-In unique was its guest stars. You never knew who would show up. Fast, loud, and unpredictable, it was filled with quick-cut comedy sketches and catchphrases that young audiences loved. The show made fun of everything, including politics. Some of Nixon's advisors thought appearing on Laugh-In was a terrible idea, others believed it could make him seem more relatable. Paul Keyes, a conservative writer for the show and a Nixon supporter, pushed hard for it. He argued that a few seconds of humor could change how people saw Nixon. On September 12, Nixon arrived at NBC's Burbank studios to film his segment, but there was a problem. The producers wanted him to say something silly like, "You bet your sweet bippy." Nixon refused. He didn't understand the phrase and didn't want to look foolish. He finally agreed to one line, "Sock it to me." Even that took effort. It took 6 takes to get a version where he didn't look annoyed or confused. The show's producer, George Schlatter, later said he rushed the footage out of the studio, afraid Nixon's team might try to stop it from airing. When the episode aired on September 16, people were stunned. Nixon's appearance lasted only 6 seconds, but it was so unexpected that it got a huge reaction. His awkwardness made people laugh. He didn't come across as hilarious or charming, but he seemed human, and in politics, that mattered. At the time, Laugh-In was the highest-rated show on TV, which meant Nixon's cameo reached millions of viewers. Some political analysts believe it helped him win over undecided voters, especially younger ones. The election was incredibly close. He defeated Hubert Humphrey by less than 1% of the popular vote. In such a tight race, every little moment counted. Humphrey, however, made a mistake. He was also invited to appear on Laugh-In and was given a simple line, "Yes, please do sock it to me." But he turned it down. He thought it would make him look unserious. Nixon took the risk, and Humphrey didn't. In the end, one candidate embraced modern media, while the other stayed away. Today, it's normal for politicians to appear on late-night talk shows, but in 1968, it was a gamble, and for Nixon, it paid off. In 1969, Harry Belafonte filmed a segment for Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In that never made it to air. It was meant to be a powerful statement. He performed the calypso song "Don't Stop the Carnival," but the real impact came from what played behind him. Instead of the usual bright and colorful set, the screen was filled with footage from the 1968 Democratic National Convention protests in Chicago. Police were beating demonstrators in the streets. Tear gas filled the air. Protesters chanted, "The whole world is watching." It was raw, real, and impossible to ignore. The protests had been one of the most shocking moments in modern American history. Thousands of demonstrators gathered in Chicago to protest the Vietnam War. They were met by a massive force of police and National Guardsmen. The violence peaked on August 28 outside the Conrad Hilton Hotel. Officers swung batons at unarmed protesters. Tear gas sent crowds running. Journalists captured the chaos on live television, forcing the country to see what was happening. Now, a year later, Belafonte wanted to make sure people didn't forget. NBC refused to air it. Executives thought it was too risky. They feared backlash, especially from conservative audiences and advertisers. The footage had already caused national outrage when it was first broadcast in 1968. Now, paired with Belafonte's song, it became even more confrontational. The network wasn't willing to take that chance. They cut the entire segment before it could ever be seen. This kind of censorship wasn't new. In the 1960s, television networks carefully controlled what made it to air. They avoided controversial topics like racism, war, and police violence because they didn't want to alienate viewers or sponsors. Even Laugh-In, a show known for pushing boundaries, had to walk a fine line. Its creator, George Schlatter, later admitted that cutting Belafonte's segment was a missed opportunity. It could have been one of television's most powerful moments. Belafonte didn't stay silent. He called NBC's decision cowardly. He had spent years using his music and fame to fight for civil rights. He saw this censorship as proof that networks were more concerned with keeping people comfortable than telling the truth. The lost segment became a what-if, a moment that could have made history but was erased before anyone had the chance to see it. Apart from that, in 1969, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In took a direct shot at Vice President Spiro Agnew. He had a habit of using dramatic and over-the-top language to attack critics of the Nixon administration. One of his most famous lines was "nattering nabobs of negativism," a phrase written for him by speechwriter William Safire. He loved alliteration and often used phrases like pusillanimous pussyfooters and an effete corps of impudent snobs. His language made him an easy target for satire. Laugh-In jumped on the opportunity and exaggerated his style, turning him into a larger-than-life caricature. Agnew and the Nixon White House were not amused. Reports say his office called NBC to complain. But this was more than just a joke at his expense, it was a sign of the growing divide between politicians and the media. Laugh-In was one of the biggest shows on television, reaching millions of viewers each week. By mocking Agnew, it showed how comedy was becoming a powerful tool for political commentary. Agnew wanted to rally Nixon's silent majority by attacking the press and intellectuals. Instead, he made himself an easy punchline. His reaction to the parody only reinforced the idea that he could dish it out but couldn't take it. The more he fought back, the more comedians latched onto him as a source of endless material. This moment showed how humor could expose the absurdity of politics. At a time when the country was deeply divided over Vietnam and civil rights, comedy was becoming more than entertainment, it was shaping public perception. Another way Laugh-In made its mark was through the Flying Fickle Finger of Fate award. This was one of the show's most famous running gags. Introduced in 1968, the award was given to people or institutions responsible for ridiculous or harmful actions. The trophy itself was a gold hand with a pointing finger mounted on a wooden base. It was a funny but direct way of calling someone out. One of the earliest winners was President Lyndon B. Johnson. The show mocked him for escalating the Vietnam War. The Pentagon also received the award for wasting taxpayer money on directories that became outdated almost immediately. Laugh-In had a way of turning real frustrations into humor, calling out government waste and hypocrisy without making the show feel heavy or preachy. The Fickle Finger of Fate was so effective because it made serious points in a way that felt lighthearted. By turning political criticism into comedy, the show avoided outright censorship. But the people it mocked took notice. Sometimes, the reactions from politicians made the joke even funnier. The segment proved that television wasn't just for entertainment, it had the power to influence public debate. By 1970, Laugh-In took an even bigger risk with a sketch that caused instant controversy. The segment depicted police officers as pigs. The image had been popularized by the Black Panther Party, which used it in cartoons to protest police brutality. Seeing this kind of imagery on mainstream television was shocking at the time. The FBI saw it as a serious problem. Under J. Edgar Hoover, the Bureau had launched COINTELPRO, a secret operation designed to discredit radical groups. Hoover had called the Black Panthers the biggest threat to America's security. Any media that seemed sympathetic to them was seen as dangerous. When Laugh-In aired the sketch, the backlash was immediate. Law enforcement groups were furious and accused the show of promoting anti-police propaganda. The controversy reflected the deep divide in the country. Protests against police brutality were becoming more common, and the Black Panthers had forced a national conversation about racial injustice. Some viewers saw the sketch as an honest reflection of the times. Others saw it as an attack on law enforcement. The reaction showed how powerful comedy could be. The show also faced backlash from early LGBTQ+ activists. One of its recurring characters was Tiny Alice, played by Dick Martin in drag. The character was meant to be funny, but the humor relied on exaggerated stereotypes of effeminate gay men. At a time when LGBTQ+ people were fighting for respect, this kind of portrayal felt damaging. It wasn't just about Laugh-In, it was about the way Hollywood treated queer characters in general. Drag performances in mainstream media often played into the idea that being gay was something ridiculous. Activists wanted representation that didn't reduce them to a joke. Comedy still saw queer identity as an easy punchline. Moreover, Artie Johnson's famous catchphrase, "very interesting," was never part of the script. It happened by accident, and not everyone was happy about it. Johnson was playing Wolfgang, a clueless German soldier who still believed World War II was happening. In one scene, he threw in the line on the spot. The phrase came from a 1942 film called Desperate Journey, but the way Johnson delivered it, deadpan with perfect timing, made it unforgettable. The audience loved it. The producers, not so much. They worried that too much improvisation would mess with the show's fast-paced rhythm. But Johnson kept doing it, and soon, the line became one of the most quoted in television. Fans started saying it everywhere. What started as a small joke turned into one of Laugh-In's most iconic moments. Goldie Hawn's smile lit up the screen, but behind it, she was struggling. She joined Laugh-In when she was just 22, playing the bubbly blonde that America fell in love with. But the pressure was crushing her. Every day, she felt like she had to be perfect, always funny, always happy, always on. It was exhausting. She later admitted that she cried almost every single day during her time on the show. The fast-paced schedule left no time to breathe. If a joke didn't land, if a scene didn't go well, she felt like she was failing. The stress led to panic attacks. She started going to therapy just to get through it. After 3 seasons, she couldn't take it anymore. She left the show in 1970 and took a chance on film. It was the best decision of her life. Her role in Cactus Flower won her an Oscar, and Hollywood gave her the creative freedom she had never felt on Laugh-In. But even as her career took off, she didn't forget what she went through. Later in life, she became an advocate for mental health, using her own struggles to help others. She had spent years making people laugh while battling her own fears, and she wanted to make sure others knew they weren't alone. For a show that thrived on controversy, Laugh-In still had to fight battles with the censors. One of the strangest came in 1969 over a single word, pregnant. At the time, network executives thought it was too indecent for television. Saying the word out loud, even in a joke, was considered inappropriate. The scene that caused the problem featured Ruth Buzzi holding a sign that said, "Make war, not love," while her character was visibly pregnant. NBC executives panicked. They wanted it changed, afraid of upsetting conservative viewers. Producer George Schlatter refused. He argued that if Laugh-In could get away with risque jokes and double entendres, then there was no reason pregnant should be off limits. The show had always pushed boundaries, and this was no different. He stood his ground, knowing the network couldn't afford to lose Laugh-In's massive audience. NBC finally gave in. The word stayed, and the sketch aired. It was a small victory, but it mattered. It showed that television was changing. What once had been considered too controversial was slowly becoming normal. By the time Laugh-In reached its 5th season in 1971, something had changed. The energy that once made it a phenomenon had started to fade. Audiences could feel it. The same jokes, the same catchphrases, what once felt fresh now seemed predictable. Goldie Hawn and Lily Tomlin left to chase bigger careers. Their absence created a gap that new cast members struggled to fill. Ratings took a hit, dropping nearly 40%. Behind the scenes, the situation wasn't any better. George Schlatter, the show's original producer, also left around this time. Without him, Laugh-In struggled to evolve. Television was changing fast. The early 1970s brought a shift in comedy, moving away from quick gags and absurdity towards something more grounded. Audiences wanted humor that reflected the real world. Laugh-In tried to keep up but never quite found its footing. By 1973, after 6 seasons, NBC decided to pull the plug. The final episode aired on May 14, 1973. By then, the show was only a shadow of what it had been. Dan Rowan closed the episode with a simple but honest line, "We've just run out of gas." It was a rare moment of truth in television. The show had pushed boundaries, broken rules, and redefined comedy. But all things end. This was the moment Laugh-In said goodbye. Its influence, however, didn't disappear. Just 2 years later, in 1975, Saturday Night Live hit the air, and it was impossible to ignore the similarities, the fast-paced humor, the unpredictable sketches, the way it used comedy to reflect the world. Lorne Michaels, SNL's creator, has never denied the connection. Laugh-In laid the foundation. Saturday Night Live built on it. Both shows launched stars. Laugh-In gave the world Goldie Hawn and Lily Tomlin. Saturday Night Live introduced Chevy Chase and Gilda Radner. Both created running jokes that stuck in people's minds. But there was a key difference. Laugh-In thrived on silliness and slapstick. Saturday Night Live had an edge. It wasn't just making people laugh, it was making a statement.